Great. Welcome again. My name is Thomas Vesperl. I'm the resident writing consultant here at the Copenhagen Business School. I work over in the library, as some of you know. And today we're going to talk about how to write the analysis of a research project. That analysis section fits into a much larger program, both for this series, but also your program as researchers and writers. So you have a lot of different things you're going to be doing. This is just a very little chunk of it. And what I'd like to do is work through this. And now, all right, we're improvising. I forgot my notes. Fortunately, I know what I'm going to say. So hopefully, what may happen is that I will be writing extra text under the video when I post it. So if I forgot anything, it'll be there, right? I apologize in advance, but I think I planned this out and I can see it in my mind's eye. All right, so what we're going to do is, just like we have been for the last few weeks, we are going to say, never start this kind of planning problem that you have. How am I going to write the analysis section with no framework, like on a blank page. So we're going to put a line through the page and we're going to distinguish two different components of the problem. We're going to ask ourselves, what is the basis on which I'm going to write the analysis section, right? And what is the purpose for which I'm writing that analysis section? These two questions are the ones you want to be asking yourself every time, and you want to give yourself really clear answers. I'm going to be giving you, obviously, some very general answers. And what I encourage you to do when you work this out for yourself is that you, on your piece of paper, you don't write my words, right? You write the things that would be the answers to these questions. And I'm going to give you some general themes, but you're going to fill them in ways that are very specific to you. The other thing that that I would encourage you to do is, today we're going to talk about the analysis, right? But what we want to do is say, whatever we decide about the analysis is going to be different from the decisions we made about the theory section and about the methods section and so forth. Right? We're going to be able to distinguish theory from analysis by virtue of the answers we give to the question, on what basis am I writing this? For what purpose am I writing this, right? So because we have different answers to those questions for the different sections, we know we're doing different things when we're writing them, right? And that's what we want to keep track of. That's why we want to be thinking in this way. And I could obviously distinguish them from all the sections. Today, just to keep things simple, I'm going to distinguish them primarily from the background section and the theory section, as I think I alluded to before we began. Background section, right? So there's going to be a background section and a theory section. I won't say too much about the background section. Yes. Yes, although we will get back to that both tomorrow, and remind me if I don't say something. I'll leave it open just for now. Right. But you know what? I'm a people pleaser. So we're just we'll put it on there and then we'll just take that. We'll also distinguish it from the discussion. Just remember, we're going to get into the weeds on that next week and when we get to actually talking about the discussion. Right. And because it's actually, I just realized that this is actually interestingly distinctive. Because we can look at what the basis is, and the discussion is very different. Yes, ma'am? Yes. When we're talking about the analysis section, it's a really good question. We're talking about the things that some people just call findings, some people call results. And the separation into results and discussion and that sort of thing, this is, again, I would say, even these headings are just me putting some labels on things. And if you want to put different labels on your things, that's fine, right? I'm covering everything that includes results and the analysis of those results, right? We'll talk a little bit about how that will look as well. So I think you'll be, I think you'll see how that works. So we know the theory section. I'll talk about something we're familiar with. We know that the theory section is based on the literature, right? And it's based on the literature you reviewed in your literature review. If you have a literature review, right? If you've actually done, you should review the literature. You should read it, find good literature and read it. Not necessarily write a literature review, but maybe, but some of you will do that as well. But there'll be a literature. And so you know you're writing the theory section if you're basing it on the scientific literature that you've found by reading journal articles, books, and so forth, right? You'll know you're writing the background section if you're finding the sorts of sources, the documentation that you need to support factual claims. And we're going to have an interesting distinction today that we well, just right over here actually, between factual writing, right, and empirical. Now, for many people, those words mean exactly the same thing, and that's, in most cases, there's nothing wrong with that, actually. Facts are empirical facts in the sense that they're based on experience, right? But the whole point of having empirical facts as distinct from mere facts, right, is that empirical facts are ones you learn about by gathering data. Like they're empirical in the sense that there's like scientific, and you can account for your method in gathering those facts, right? So the background section is going to be factual. It will tell you a bunch of facts, but it's not going to be empirical because you haven't gone out and collected data to observe those facts, right? You've just read about them. Maybe you've read about them in The Economist or in the Financial Times, right? Or you've read a nice, like a nonfiction historical book or a journalistic book on it or something like that, right? So you've been out, you've studied the subject, you've gotten yourself some information about the region or the country or the organization or the product or the management style or whatever it is that you're studying, right? You've got some information about that. And that's what you wrote about in your background section. You're not claiming to have primary data on this, right? You're just claiming to have looked into it. You've claimed to have studied it in sort of a scholarly way. Right? So that's what I mean by documentation. You haven't said, I talked to some people, I looked around, I think I know what I'm talking about, trust me. Right? You are providing some sources. Yes? Yes. Yeah. A really good way of making that distinction between documents and literature is that the literature is going to be something you will expect your reader to have read as well. So your reader is familiar with the literature, right? You've reviewed the literature to get yourself into the same space mentally as the reader, whereas the documentation that you provide is information you're guiding the reader to the sources, but you're not expecting the reader to have read those, right? Yeah, it's a little bit of a technical distinction. It really depends on whether or not it shaped your reader's expectations or not of the analysis. We'll talk a little bit about that. The background section is really just a matter of informing the reader about some facts that the reader needs, but wouldn't necessarily have just because they're in the same discipline as you, right? Because you looked at this company, you looked at this organization. So it's much more specific in that sense, right? And then we can ask, well, what is the analysis based on? Well, it's based on your data, right? And the data is, I've always sort of tried to say this in terms of I used to make this mistake all the time. I used to say it's Greek for what is given, right? But it's not, it's Latin for what is given. I don't know why I said Greek. So it is Latin for what is given, for like a gift, right? And so the data is what you have wrought from experience, right? You've wrought from experience at great effort. You've wrung it, wrested it from nature, right? You have possessed it yourself, right? And now you can take it for granted in your analysis, right? And we talked about this last week. In your method section, what you have done is you have won your reader's trust. So in the methods section, the reader has come to trust your way of gathering data. And so by the time you get to the analysis, you can just refer to it, right, in a straightforward way. Right? You don't have to worry about whether or not the reader is going to believe that these people actually said that, or this actually happened, right? Because they understand how you went about gathering this data, right? Does that make sense? So we actually have three kind of piles of sources. We have a pile of newspaper articles, nonfiction books, historical accounts, and so forth over here. We then have the results of our literature review, right? Usually a bunch of scientific articles, usually understood in terms of some sort of citation network, right? So you've kind of understood how it's a conversation, right? And then we have a pile of data of some kind, right? And if you keep these separate, you also know what you're doing, right? You know what you're working on. And then the question was, can you say something about how this fits into the discussion, or how this distinguishes from the sources we base our discussion on? And there's really two kinds of answers to this. My kind of provocative answer is to say there is no sources for your discussion, none like that. What's under your discussion is just your ability to think, right? Just your capacity for reason, for rational thought, for logical deduction, for reaching conclusions, implications, if you will, of what you have, of what your analysis shows. So in that sense, there's no sources. But in another sense, you could say the discussion will refer back to everything else that you've already based your different sections on. The trick here, and we'll talk about this when we talk about writing the discussion, the trick here is to make sure that you don't introduce any new sources. Right? So you don't want to introduce new data points in your discussion. You don't want to introduce a piece of literature you haven't already discussed in your theory. You don't want to suddenly tell the reader a fact that the reader should have known before you even got through the analysis, right? So in the discussion, you don't want to bring in, it's kind of cheating to bring in new facts there and new sources. So in that sense, nothing new, right? But in another sense, everything you've already used. Right? Everything is fair game. You can refer back to everything you've already cited in your discussion. So you can still have references. Right? Does that make sense? So it's less the actual basis, and it's more the use of the basis that changes a little bit. Right? Okay. So let's now think about what the purpose of this analysis section is going to be. And this actually depends a little bit on some decisions you've made, especially with regard to your theory, right? Theory can be approached in different ways, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. One way is as a system of expectation or a set of presumptions about how the world must or ought to be, right? Or how we presume some things about the regularity of the universe, right? So we have some expectations. Right? One way to write your theory section is as an arrangement of concepts that remind the reader what the reader expects of your object of research. And of course, it's on this background, right? So you've already said something about where are we in the world, and now you're going to say, I'm going to use this theory, so the reader is going to expect a certain kind of analysis, right? And then the question is, what is the analysis going to do with those expectations? Yes, sir. That's a really good question. So the question is for the people on the microphone. The question is, these expectations, what do they have to do with the hypotheses, right? And in a certain sense, the hypotheses are, because usually you'll articulate hypotheses that are quite reasonable, and then you'll go out and confirm them with your data, right? So you'll prove the hypotheses correct, right? That's very normal. And so what I'm about to say wouldn't work with that, right? But what these expectations really are is your null hypothesis. And if you remember from the theory part, or if you go back and watch it, I talked about Ezra Zuckerman, who says the purpose of your literature review is actually to help you construct a compelling null hypothesis, right? So that we're not generating a null hypothesis that's obviously true, oh, sorry, obviously untrue, so that we can easily reject it. What we're going to do is use the background information and the theory to construct a compelling idea of, a vision of what the analysis could show that makes a lot of sense. It's very rational. This is what one would expect, knowing nothing else, right? Really just understanding the theory and with some background conditions. And then you're going to say, but we've thought about this in a particular way. And we've noticed that there are actually some things in this context that might confound that null hypothesis, that might lead us to reject it. And so if we were to reject the null hypothesis, these 3 or 4 hypotheses would be true, right? And so we're generating our hypotheses in contrast to the null, right? But the expectations I'm talking about are the expectations that underlie the null hypothesis, right? Because that sets us up for the, and that's why you could ask, well, where do the hypotheses then go? Do they go in the theory section? Some will say they go in the theory at the end of the theory section. Some would put them at the beginning of the method section, or some would just have a section called hypotheses, right? Between the theory and the method. Because what you want to do is say, here's what the theory would have thought. Here's what we kind of think, right? And here's how we're going to test whether or not we're right. Right? So theory, hypotheses, method. And that brings us to this whole rejecting the null idea, right? Because if you're working in that paradigm and that kind of hypothesis testing, sort of, you call it falsificationism or positivism or whatever you like, then the purpose of the analysis is going to be to bring about the artful disappointment of the reader's expectations of the object, right? The artful disappointment, not the artless disappointment of the reader's expectations of your intelligence, right? What you want to do is you want to make sure that you've got an analysis that pushes gently, interestingly against the reader's compelling null hypothesis. So the thing that the reader would have thought, and quite rationally so, because the reader understands the literature, has thought seriously about this, and has some general historical information about how businesses work, maybe in that sector and so forth. So the reader is kind of on board, has some expectations and ideas. It's perfectly legitimate that they have those opinions, right? Those presumptions are perfectly legit. It's just they haven't studied the matter as closely as you have, right? So you will be in a position to say, you get ready for a disappointment because you thought your theory was so beautiful. Actually, reality is more interesting, right? Everybody, and of course, it's not really disappointing because everybody wants that. Everybody wants to learn more from reality than they could have read from a book, right? That's why they're reading your paper, right? So they're as far as they've gotten as far as you got in theory, and then you took them the rest of the way by pushing against what their theories expected, right? A few years ago, I was told, Thomas, disappointment is no matter what you do, Thomas, you're never going to get disappointment to sound like a good thing. So you need a better word for it. And the word I came up with, I think, or was given by a student, was it could be challenging, right? There are no problems, there are just challenges, right? There are no disappointments in life, there are just occasions for further challenges. So keep that in mind. That's really all I mean. I just mean that your analysis will be written in such a way that it explicitly challenges the very expectations that you set up in the theory section, right? That's going to be the goal of the analysis. Now, even putting it that way, even being as hopefully charming as that was, some people will say, I don't work this way. I'm not going to have a theory and deduce hypotheses and test whether or not they actually, it's not how I'm going to work. That's just not how we do it in our discipline. And it doesn't sound very interesting to me. It just sounds aggressive and wrong. That is legit in some in some disciplines. And so you have an alternative. You can use your theory not to activate the reader's expectations, but to shape the reader's curiosity. And I think a good one here to use, I mean, we could use this one would also work with expectations. But we could, for example, if I used Edgar Schein's organizational culture theory, right, then I might say, well, it has some artifacts and it has some espoused values and it has some underlying assumptions, right? So that's how a culture has these three layers. They're kind of layers. I think he even uses an iceberg sometimes to describe them. And obviously the underlying assumptions are the ones that are harder to move, and the artifacts are the ones that can be exchanged and they can be different and they're a little more ephemeral, right? So what I can do is I can use that theory after I've told you about some organization whose culture I'm going to describe, after I've informed you about that organization, I can use Edgar Schein's theory of organizational culture to get you curious about how that culture works. What are their artifacts? What role do they play in relation to expressing the espoused values and so forth, right? So I can use the theory section to just get the reader curious about specific, kind of guide the reader's attention to uncovering details in this organization's life, right? Especially because I've set up certain, maybe they've got, maybe my background is these two organizations are going to merge, right? So I've got two organizations, they're going to merge. Interesting organizational culture issue there. How are they going to transfer the knowledge from one organization to another? And of course, Schein's theory has all kinds of expectations about what's going to work, what's not going to work, what's going to be a problem, what's going to be easy, right? So I'm using the literature, I'm basing it on the literature, but I'm using the theory section to shape my reader's curiosity about what my analysis is going to show about how this merger actually worked. And then I'm not going to disappoint my reader's expectations, right? If I'm making the reader curious, I'm going to do what we always do with curiosity. I'm going to satisfy it, right? I guess arguably, especially in this sort of postmodern, flip the script, break the narrative kind of age that we're in, maybe you can technically artfully frustrate the reader's curiosity, right? Maybe that could be part of your analysis, and maybe some readers will find that clever, but most readers will want to, if you've made me curious, please satisfy my curiosity. I've got questions, I want you to give me the answers, right? So that's kind of the second option. Now, these are just two ways of conceptualizing this. If you do choose to go either of these two ways, don't just satisfy yourself with, well, I'm going to do curiosity satisfaction and write that in your notes too, right? What you want to do is say, I'm going to get my reader curious about this, 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 and this, and this. And the satisfying facts that I'm going to bring to the table are going to be this, 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 and this, right? So now notice what's happening here, and this is absolutely ideal writing form, right? Is that you're going to let your theory guide your presentation of the analysis, right? Because the theory, you're aware of what expectations or what curiosity you've stimulated in your reader. So you're going to let that awareness of what you've got your reader to expect, you're going to let that shape the way you present the analysis as well, right? That's not like my logic teacher said, right? Being goal-oriented is not cheating. Just be, you know where you're going, get there, right? Get there as most effectively as you can, right? You don't have to stumble into these things. And of course, I always feel a little bit like I have to apologize or kind of like give you even more freedom, because there is much more freedom. There are other ways of thinking about this. You just want to make decisions like this. What did I do in the theory section? Right? What was my purpose in writing the theory? And how am I responding to that project in the analysis? How am I letting the theory guide the analysis? I guess one way we could put this is just say that you want to make sure that the reader feels like there was some purpose, like some reason to read all those pages of theory. Why did we have to go? Why did you have to tell me your theory? Right? By the time I get to the analysis, all that becomes very clear. Oh, because I needed this data to be framed in this way. Right? There should be a feeling of satisfaction no matter how you do it. Yep. Yes, I would, again, that's kind of like analysis and results. I would say analytical framework or conceptual frame or model even belongs in the theory, or it's for me, it's under the heading of theory. It's possible, just like we had the hypotheses out in a separate section, that you do something like literature review theory, and then you say model or analytical framework as a separate heading, so that we really get, and especially if you have something that is a very schematic kind of model of the analysis presented like that. Yeah. Which actually raises another great question, which is, does it have to be in this exact order, right? And not really. And sometimes people will even have an analysis that, or have a project where it seems much more natural to have parts of the theory presented, and then the analysis of the data that's relevant to that part of the theory, and then you go back and do some more theory, and you do some more analysis, some more theory, more analysis, right? The other thing that can happen is you have theory, method, then you have the analytical model, and then you present the analysis, right? That's all possible. But I would still say that the analytical model is really just a summary of those expectations or that curiosity, right? It's a schema for reading the analysis. But yeah, it's all decisions you're making as you go. Good. So I hope that's reasonably clear, right? And we can remember, we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. What I want to do now is try to take you through how to do this paragraph for paragraph, right? Because I think I've been underplaying this a little bit since the first time, although the first time I hope I was very clear that you should be writing these projects one paragraph at a time. It takes 27 minutes to write a paragraph. You take a 3-minute break, go on to the next paragraph. Now you're writing 2 paragraphs an hour. That's really nice to know. They're at least 6 sentences long and at most 200 words. They support, elaborate, or defend, right? And what they defend is a key sentence, and that's going to be important now, but you can go back to that first lecture or all the other stuff I've written about this if you want more on exactly that sort of paragraph structure. But it's what I'm using now, because when you're doing your analysis section, when you're writing your analysis, what you want to make sure is that you have some sense of the difference between an interpretation and an observation. Right? An interpretation of facts and an observation of facts. It's all facts, right? But remember what we had. We had this idea of we had facts, right? Just right at the edge. That's good. Just a little bit. We had facts, but what we want to do is kind of talk about 2 different kinds of facts, like factual facts. Almost like this, factual and empirical. These are all going to be empirical, but some of them are going to be given facts, facts that are given to you, and remember that's your data. And some of them are going to be the way what we take the facts to mean. So taken facts, right? We're going to have taken, facts that are taken, and facts that are given. Right? At this point, I try not to make the obvious movie reference joke. I just failed. I'm going to do it anyway. That you need a very particular set of skills to do an analysis, right? You can look it up. A very particular set of skills if you're going to have your facts taken, right? So what I want to do is try to set this up in such a way. Remember that we're talking about a paragraph, and this is not a paragraph. It's just a box. I'm going to divide it up like this. Yep. Sure. It's not. It doesn't go to this. Well, okay. Yes. Yeah, that's a great, I think it will become clear. I think that's, I'm kind of going there. But it's a good question, right? If the basis is the same, right? If it is the case that the given facts are what the data are, right? Then what, and the taken facts, right? What we take the facts to mean, right, is going to be something else. Aren't they still just given, right? Yeah.
To observe what the data is, I still need to interpret the data, from which point it becomes a data.
Yes, a taken fact. Or I just realized what another way of putting this would be an accomplished fact, right? So we're going to have facts that are accomplished by your analysis, right? Facts that we wouldn't know they were facts until you analyze the data. And then they're going to be the facts that are given to us regardless of what you think, because your data, your method, sorry, made you go out and look and you had these observations. Yeah, go ahead.
Just think of it, the data, like facts that are elemental to each other, and the taken facts or the accomplished facts, are sort of facts that emerge from the arrangement of the data within each other.
Very much so. Yes, I would say, I mean, again, we don't want to get into too much philosophy there. I'm not sure they're emergent necessarily in the philosophical sense, but they are, yeah, facts that emerge from the analysis in that kind of sense. The data is just there, just lying around, and the analysis will get some other facts to emerge at a kind of higher level. Yeah, basically at a higher level. Yeah, yeah. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to distinguish in the paragraph between, and this is just ordinary paragraph structure, the key sentence and the support. In this case, very often support, but I will put in parentheses down here the elaboration, and even in rare instances, the defense of the key sentence. Remember, every paragraph has a key sentence that says what the paragraph says. It's one of the sentences is usually a nice, simple declarative sentence. Sentence making is a retrospective process, or the internet has changed the way businesses communicate with their customers, right? Nice, simple declarative sentence, right? That's the key sentence. The rest of the paragraph, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sentences, whatever, are going to either support, elaborate, or defend the key sentence, all depending on whether or not the reader will have a hard time believing, understanding, or agreeing with you, right? In the case of the analysis, we'll mostly be talking about paragraphs that say things that the reader needs help believing. And that's not because the reader is super skeptical and refusing to believe you. It's just that, well, we're in the analysis, so you're supposed to establish these facts for me. You're supposed to tell me things that are true, and then tell me why I should believe them. Right, that's what I want in the analysis, right? So most of the paragraphs are not going to be explaining what things mean. They're going to be supporting, right? They're not going to be elaborating or defending. They'll be supporting. And this is where we get to the question, right? Because what's the key sentence going to be? The key sentence is going to state an interpretation. And then the support for that interpretation is going to be an arrangement, right? That's a good way of putting it. So the interpretation emerges from the arrangement of observations. Right? Now, you probably want some kind of example. And this, for once, I can actually, I think, give you a pretty clear example, right? So suppose you're doing semi-structured interviews, right? Some people are doing that, so it's good. You could be, but you could be doing field work, or you could even be using like market data and stuff, right? It would still be the same. But suppose you're using semi-structured interviews. What that means is you've gone out and talked to some people, asked them some questions, probably recorded them, probably transcribed those recordings, and probably coded them in some way. And all of that has, of course, been made clear in your theory and method, how your coding scheme works and all that kind of stuff. So the reader understands that there is this coded transcript available to you, right? Those are all observations. They're observations of what people said, how often they said certain things, right? Which themes returned again and again and so forth, right? So you've got a set of data that would be like that no matter what it meant, right? The people you talk to said these words, right? In this order, at these times, right? In response to these questions, right? That's data, right? And of course, in some cases, the methods or your exam rules will say you have to print out the transcript, or sorry, you have to attach the transcripts. You no longer have to print anything out, I don't think. You have to attach the transcripts, right, as an appendix. Some people don't have to do that. Some people have to submit their tapes as well, their recordings and so forth, right? So you have the data there, and it is immutable, right? It is given to you. You can't do anything about it. That is the data, no matter how much you would like them to have said something else, no matter how convenient it would have been if they told you other things, right? You're stuck with the data. It's given to you, right? Those are all observations. But of course, there's a difference between them saying certain things and it's something like this. The employees of company A are worried about whether or not they'll still have jobs after the merger, right? Now, somebody may have said, I'm worried about my job, right? Which is great, a great observation to underpin that interpretation, but it's not always the case that you're going to have that clear data to support your interpretations. Sometimes it's going to be just the meaning that you give to the words they say because you ask them in this way, and they kept talking about these things. This seems to be like they kept talking about how they're now on LinkedIn more and they're looking for work and kind of thing, right? That seems to be some kind of worry that they're going to be made irrelevant by the merger, right? And of course, that's what you're going to explain down in your paragraph. You're going to say, they're worried about their future, right? Here's what they said. Because the only thing you have to support any claim you make, if you're strictly working with semi-structured interviews, right, the only evidence you have is what they said in the interviews. Right? Does that make sense? So if you keep every paragraph nicely organized like this, I'm going to have a key sentence that offers an interpretation that attributes some meaning to what so a good way of putting this, I'll try to color. Is to say that you're going to attribute some meaning to them, right? And then the question is, what is their observation? Well, the only thing in semi-structured interviews, the only thing we have is some saying, right? So there's what they meant and what they said. And we're going to organize every paragraph in such a way that we're constantly telling the reader what we think they mean. We're attributing a fear, a hope, a dream, a belief even, right, to the object, to the people that we've studied, right? And our evidence for that is what they said, right? In the context they said it. Now, of course, let's say you're doing participant observation. You've been out in the field, you've observed, you've taken notes and so forth, right? But you've got some other things down here now. You've got doing, right? You've observed what they did. So you've probably also talked to them. So you've also got what they've said, right? But you've also got descriptions of their activities, right? So you're going to, in your data, sorry, in the paragraph supporting the interpretation that they're afraid, you're going to tell us what they did. Yep. No, that's the interpretation. Yeah, that's, well, like I say, sometimes you will be kind of lucky, I guess, right? Sometimes there will be some data that explicitly says what you also want to interpret, right? So you're quoting them for your interpretation. But of course, you have to remember that if it's the chief financial officer of the company and he tells you we're doing great, everything in this organization is just top quality, top-notch financial shape, right? Well, he has an interest in telling you that, right? So you're not going to take that as evidence for you may not take that as evidence for the financial health of the company, right? So sometimes they'll say something, but you have to say methodologically, we can't just count that as an interpretation, right? That's part of our evidence. It may be part of the observations, but if I'm going to say the company's in good shape, I'm probably going to need some more data points. Right?
Then what was the observation?
The observations will always be, in the case of interview-based data, will always be quotations or paraphrases from the interviews. So what the people said, right? Yeah, they will have told you they looked at LinkedIn if it's interviews, right? If you haven't watched them do it, then, right? Yeah. But it'll always be things they told you, right? So what we were told in the interviews was this kind of stuff, right? And then up here, you're going to have, maybe financial health is a little bit too far off. I mean, if we were again doing this sort of Edgar Schein organizational culture thing, and we were going to say, there is a clash of cultures between the two organizations, well, then I'm going to need my interviews in the two organizations to provide me with observations that I can use to say the underlying assumptions of this organization are like this, the underlying assumptions of this organization are like this, right? So those are interpretations guided by my theoretical curiosity, right? But the only evidence I can offer is, well, when we talked to them, they said this. And when these people over in this organization talked to us, they said this. I said it's possible to have elaborating and defending paragraphs because sometimes you'll say, your interpretation will be that your interpreting statement will just be that they had a great party, right? Or something. And then what you want to do is explain to the reader what in that culture, what it means, right? So you're just actually elaborating. You're not getting the reader to believe, you're helping the reader understand. Most of that kind of stuff, though, I would encourage you, I would put in the background section. Right? If there's something about the organization that the reader has to understand in order to get the analysis, right, it can be useful to put it in the background section and document it without using your data, but document it just using publicly available information. Right? But that's a really subtle distinction that you don't really necessarily. And then sometimes you will say they're worried about their future. And you'll look at your data and you'll say, look, I interviewed 20 people and I know they're worried about their future. I could feel it. I'm looking at my data. I'm having a hard time actually finding the observations that I can put together to really get this across to my reader. So I'm going to defend my position that they're worried about their future against what the reader would make of my data. So I'm going to acknowledge to my reader that the data has to be read with a twist or with a grain of salt or something like that in order for my interpretation to count. I'm going to say, I understand that I don't actually have the money quote, right, that I would need to get this point across, but I'm telling you, right, my reading of this, my experience of this is gives me the information. Yeah, exactly. And that's why you'd be defending, right? So when you're saying we, you're saying, I know, dear reader, that you're resisting this. You're going to resist this one. But it's important for the overall, we won't be understanding this culture properly if we don't recognize that they're worried about their future, right? Only if your sense of your reader is that your gut instinct is an argument, right? That's why defending is a different thing from supporting, because what you're going to do is you're going to say, I know you're going to come away from this paragraph unconvinced. Right? I don't have time in a paragraph to convince you of this. I'm just trying to make you believe, not believe in the sense of the facts. I'm just trying to make you understand or believe that I am a rational person, right? I've thought about this and I am aware of your concerns, dear reader. I take them seriously, right? That's why it's always a defensive posture, right? I'm just defending my point of view. I know this is kind of weak, right? But once I put all of these ideas together, all of these interpretations together, I promise you, dear reader, that you will come around to my point of view, right? Because otherwise the discussion is not going to make sense. So obviously you don't want to have your entire analysis be defensive. And a few of the paragraphs could sometimes be defensive. Right? Yes, ma'am. Again, I can't tell you what's enough in your discipline with your reader. Remember, your reader is always ideally the smartest, most interesting student in your cohort. So you just try to imagine sort of somebody at eye level with you, right? And you just say, okay, what would that reader make of my data? What would that reader make of this interpretation? And then you also have to say, what would they make of my argument? Now, like, you're probably not going to be able to get away with just saying, I feel it, right? It's my truth, right? It's probably not going to work. You're going to still adduce evidence. So you'll still be using observations because you're in the analysis, right? You'll still be quoting people, but you're going to be presenting it against the reader's interpretation instead of presenting it just as support for your interpretation, right? You'll just say, here's what I think is the best way to interpret this. Here's what I think is the best way to interpret this. Here's what I think you would make of the data I have, dear reader, right? Which is not quite at the level that I would put it. And I understand the tension. Let me make an argument, right? And it's not just going to be I feel different. It's because I read this sentence that they say in the interview as actually sublimating a concern, right? So maybe I'm going to be, yeah. Yeah, go back to that financial officer that we don't trust. Think of it like a little bit like, yeah, sure, they said this, but really they meant something else, right? And in this case, I'm going to try to give you some other things that some other people said, and I'm going to try to make it, but I understand that this is really, at the end of the day, the honest thing is, it's my gut says something, and I know it, I don't quite have the support. So I know you're going to try to reject it, dear reader, but I'm going to defend myself anyway, right? And like I say, it's a rare thing, but I think that's my sense is you all think, oh, that's interesting, right? So do some of those, right? Because it makes the writing more interesting. Right? Good. This is one of the things that can happen, right? The other thing that can happen, right, is not just that there's people say things and do things, and this is especially maybe if you're doing more quantitative research or more historical research, right, is that sometimes it's not people saying and doing things that are being observed. It's just things happening, like events happening, right? So what you've got observations of is events that have happened. That could be because you've done a whole bunch of, you've got a big archive of newspaper coverage for the events that you're covering, and you're doing a discourse analysis of that, right? Part of what you're talking about is just going to be, you're going to say, then this piece was published, right? And then this, right? So there's going to be things that, events that are just things that are going on, right? And usually in the social sciences, things going on involve people saying and doing things, but sometimes we just talk about them as events happening, right? And then what we're going to want to know is what those events mean, right? So what is the significance of those events, right? And that should resonate a little bit with those of you who are doing statistical analysis, right? So what you're going to be wanting to do in your analysis is, in your interpretation, you're really talking about not just what the numbers are, but what they mean, right? i.e., what are the significant results that you have to present? So it has some of the same features there. So what are the things? Oh, the thing that yes, ma'am. Exactly. Yeah. Or because you could actually argue that in a qualitative study, you might want to move that kind of significance to the discussion. And then you would want to say, in that sense of significance, I'm talking about the implications or why it's important, like why this matters, like the so what, right? Which you might deal with in the discussion. But you just have to remember that there are events going on, and what you're trying to do in your analysis is say, why are you telling me about these events? And in that sense, they must be significant, and they mean something, right? They play a role in your analysis, and you want to just be very clear about that. And paragraph for paragraph, you're always going to make this distinction, right? My key sentence, the one that I come up with the day before, right? Say to myself before I go to sleep, is going to be an interpretation. It's going to attribute some meaning, some belief, some desire, some hope, something to the people you've studied. And then you are going to bring to the table your data, which is just your set of observations. Right? Good. So definitely one thing that I don't think I made enough of last time. I tried to write a little bit about it instead, which is when you're writing things, Hemingway has a really good way of kind of getting you to think about the kind of paragraph for paragraph or reading moment for reading moment as you pass through a text. You probably have 2 moments, 2 paragraphs to the page. You have to remember it takes about a minute to read a paragraph. So be compassionate with your reader, right? You know, say, what's going to happen during this minute, which is half a page in my reader's mind? And what Hemingway says is, think of a story as a sequence of fact and motion. A sequence of fact and motion, right? Which is to say, you can decide for yourself whether or not this paragraph is going to describe something that happened or something people did, right? It's going to have some motion involved in it. There's going to be a dynamism in this paragraph, right? It's going to describe something going on or being done. Even if my basis for it is what people said, right? So I might say in this paragraph, I'm going to basically tell a story. So the interpretation is that something happened to this person I interviewed. And then I'm going to be quoting their account of the story and paraphrasing and so forth, right? But so there's going to be this event, this motion in this paragraph. But then other paragraphs will be like, I'm just going to paint a picture. I'm just going to set a scene. I'm going to describe some facts, right? I'm going to tell the reader, this is how things are. So one question is what is happening? Another one is what is the case? And it's just a question of being either thinking about in terms of motion or in terms of stasis. And if you think of every half page of your analysis, especially, but you can do it with lots of other sections as well. Think of every half page of your analysis as, what am I trying to get the reader to do? See something in a stable way or to notice a movement, to notice a change, right? So every half page, give your reader one of those things to do, right? Sorry? Yeah, so every half page in your analysis is going to be about a paragraph. It's going to take about a minute to read. It's going to take half an hour to write. Take about a minute to read. And in that minute, you want to be very clear with yourself whether or not you want your reader to imagine a static fact, a stable thing that is the case, or some change in the facts or motion, some direction of change, right? And be kind to your reader so your reader is being moved not through just change, right? Or fact, boring fact, one after the other. Have some oscillation, have some alternation between facts and motions. And it doesn't have to be fact, motion, fact, motion, fact, motion. It could be fact, motion, motion, fact, motion, fact, right? But just be aware of what you're doing every half page in your analysis. That's a very, very useful strategy to keep in mind. And then remember that you are, you've been given, by the time you get to the analysis, you've been given some facts, and now what you're trying to do in the analysis is to accomplish them with the application of some very particular skills. Yeah. So the question is, what's the difference between a static fact and a motion? It's like the difference between a photograph and a film. So like a static fact would be a still image of what's happening right now. And motion would be things happening, right? So things going on. So, I mean, this lecture would be a good example, right? At the beginning, you all arrived. So I could describe that as a motion. The lecture hall filled up. Slowly, there was a buzz and an excitement in the air and all that kind of stuff, right? That's a motion, right? But then you just sat there. And I just stood here and I just spoke, right? So that would be more of a, then the audience is static, and then I would describe you leaving, right? It's what you choose to write about as well. I mean, it could be some facts are stable. right? And for some things, the fact is it's changing. And for other things, the fact is it's staying the same. Right? And sometimes it's just a question of perspective. I don't want to be too mystical on that, right? But it is, I mean, yeah, just you make the decision about whether or not you're trying to get the reader in the frame of, I'm looking at something for the time that I'm reading this paragraph. I'm understanding this as something that is just the case. This is, right? Or I'm watching something turn into something else, or I'm watching somebody accomplish something. I'm watching somebody transition from stage A to stage B. Right?
So would an example of that be if we were going to use the semi-structured interview text within the people who are the jobs?
Yep.
Like the static fact would be people are worried about the job, people who are supporting them would be talking about, and then perhaps like we see that the economy and there is much labor market.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Or you could say, maybe you even did something that was a little bit longitudinal. So you could say, well, at this time, people were statically worried about their jobs. Then a month later, half of the employees at Twitter got fired, right? It was more than half, I think, even, right? And you want to describe that getting fired and people leaving, right? You want to describe that as a change. Like that's a motion, getting fired. Being worried about being fired, that is static, right? But of course, you know, searching for jobs, having lots of conversations, getting drunk a lot because you're so worried that you, right? Those are all motions that also, so you could describe the anxiety in terms of motion as well. I don't want to answer that question for you, right? But yeah. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there because also we've now spent a good hour. I think I've got everything that I had in my imaginary notes. Maybe what I will do is we'll take a 5-minute break. I'll run up to my office and get my notes and see if I've forgotten anything. And then we will take questions for as long as you are interested. Remember, you can ask questions about what we talked about today or anything else related to your research projects. You're welcome.